Good morning and welcome to all here in attendance, whether here in our Zoom virtual webinar or on our YouTube channel. My name is Guy Mentel and I'm the president of Global Americans. We're thrilled to be co-sponsoring this conference alongside the Caribbean Policy Consortium on post-Summit of the Americas perspectives and assessments for the Hemisphere. For those new to Global Americans, you can find us at theglobalameriCans.org, where you'll find critical analysis on the region that seeks to broaden the discussion of the Americas and the Caribbean within the global context. If you want to stay apprised of Global Americans research and events, we'll also put a sign-up link in our chat at some point during this conversation. But I also want to point folks in attendance to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the course of this conversation, by all means, please put them in that chat, and I will be monitoring that throughout the conversation and incorporating those questions into our conversation. I'd also very quickly like to take the privilege of being alongside these wonderful panelists to announce that Global Americans recently launched a Caribbean program with support from the Open Society Foundation looking at climate change in the Caribbean. All of the information related to that Caribbean program and our Caribbean programming more broadly can be found again on our website, where we continue to churn out regular news and analysis on the Caribbean and on the important issues that we're discussing today, with many of the panelists here contributing to that work. So just to note that the Q&A box, again, I will monitor closely, but we may or may not get to all of the questions therein. But again, we do invite you to contact us in that way. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to my friend George Fauriol for introductory remarks. So George is, I'm proud to say, a Global Americans Fellow. He's also co-chair of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and an adjunct faculty member with Georgetown University's Democracy and Governance graduate program. He's held multiple positions at the National Endowment for Democracy and at CSIS, where he served as director and senior fellow of the Americas program, and has extensive international and cross-regional field experience, including election-related missions in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Central America. And he's also widely published for the purposes of this conversation, of course, on Caribbean basin politics, on US foreign and security policy in the Caribbean, and more broadly on democratization dynamics. Alicia Nicholls is an international trade specialist whose research interests include foreign investment law and policy, financing for sustainable development, investment migration programs, as well as global financial regulatory issues. Alicia regularly comments on contemporary trade matters at academic and industry conferences and events, and is also the founder of one of the Caribbean's leading blogs on trade matters. Amparo Mercader is a partner with PwC's tax practice based out of Washington, D.C. Amparo has more than 20 years of experience working with multinational companies in determining, evaluating, and documenting their global transfer pricing arrangements. Her work includes setting up international operating models, ranging from procurement centers, intangible property structures, and treasury function optimization, while also managing the global tax footprints. And Amparo is Uruguayan, but she can comment on a whole range of issues, and we look forward to that later today. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Richard Feinberg, who we're proud to say is a Global Americans International Advisory Council member. He's a professor of international political economy at UC San Diego. He's had a distinguished career as a diplomat, a policy advisor, a university professor, and an author of over 200 books and articles on international relations. He has 4 decades of engagement with United States foreign policy, which spans the whole of government, from the White House, from the Department of State, Department of Treasury to Capitol Hill, while also serving in roles for numerous DC-based public policy institutions. Richard also served as the principal architect of the 1994 Miami Summit of the Americas for the Clinton administration, and I think obviously that will be particularly relevant for this conversation today. So with that, I'll turn it over to George, who will start with introductory remarks.
You forgot me, Guy.
Right. Oh, sorry, David. David is co-chair of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, vice president of Manchester Trade, which is an international business advisory firm working on Caribbean trade, investment, and economic integration agreements. From the 1984 Caribbean Basin Initiative to present agreements such as CAFTA-DR, CARICOM, CARIFORUM. He also has 3 decades of involvement in US Caribbean relations writ large, He served as Assistant Secretary of State of Puerto Rico, as Director of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, of the Caribbean Policy Project in Antigua. In short, a ton of experience in the Caribbean. He has lived and worked across the Caribbean islands and continent and has written and lectured extensively on regional economic growth, integration, and trade and investment agreements. So with that, now I do turn it to George. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and we'll look forward to getting this panel discussion started shortly.
Thank you, Guy, and delighted to see this partnership between Global Americans and the Caribbean Policy Consortium, the CPC. For those of you that are kind of new to this environment, the CPC focuses on advancing Caribbean policy interests and essentially involves a network of policy professionals and academics in the Caribbean and North America particularly. In fact, it sort of views itself as a bridge between the world of scholarship and the policy communities, including the private sector leadership. In fact, David Lewis, one of the panelists, is a member of CPC and represents that sort of full spectrum of capabilities. Check it out at cpccaribbean.org. The panel that was just introduced is really a superb panel in terms of analyzing the recent Summer of the Americas in Los Angeles. So let me just provide a couple of sort of general observations and open up really with three sort of backdrop commentary. One of them is that one has to keep in mind that Washington, and to a varying degree the rest of the hemisphere, is preoccupied by a series of global developments, including the impact of the war in Ukraine, let alone a global pandemic and sort of the collateral social and economic implication all of this has had. And secondly, also to some degree, having to deal with a distracted Washington policy community, distracted both by domestic and a whole series of global challenges. So 4 observations on the summit in Los Angeles. First one is maybe from a 64,000-foot sort of perspective. The summit, I think, highlights 2 interrelated hemispheric weak points. One of them I've just alluded to, which is an unsteady, distracted U.S. national and to some degree regional leadership, not just globally distracted, but also distracted by a variety of different developments within the Western Hemisphere itself. And then the second issue is that the Western Hemisphere is, in fact, represented increasingly very diverse governance structures, to be charitable, and sort of practices of politics, including a mix of populism, some from the left, some from the right, as well as a rise in different forms of autocratic styles of governance. Sort of these 2 weak points, a distracted, unsteady U.S. leadership, plus a sort of variety of pressure points within the political landscape in Latin America and the Caribbean, sets the stage, I think, in some ways for ultimately a series of disappointing outcomes in Los Angeles last month. Second observation, I see the Summit of the Americas in some ways, at least from a U.S. perspective, is to some degree an extension of the administration Summit for Democracy held just 6 months ago in December. Both in a variety of different ways were in effect opportunities to strengthen democracy's capacity to counter rising populism and authoritarianism in the region. And arguably, neither the Summit for Democracy nor the Summit of the Americas achieved a lot in that particular arena. One had a sense of this just by observing the highly publicized and sort of chaotic dispute over Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan participation at the summit in Los Angeles. And what ultimately I perceived as a more serious breakdown, which were the no-shows of 3 important potential participants in terms of their leaders in the summit, Mexico and 2 key countries of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala and El Salvador. I mean, keeping in mind that, for better or for worse, for a large portion of the U.S. public, what constitutes Latin American policy is essentially defined by what happens in those 3 countries. So the absence of their leaders really makes it hard for the average citizen to take any of this particularly seriously. Third, the Summit of the Americas, and this is more of a conceptual observation, further exhibited a characteristic in US foreign policy that I would describe as sort of policy by pronouncements. Policy by pronouncement being in effect where a new policy sort of emerges, but in the absence of a clearly defined, sustainable sort of substance that matches the needed diplomatic, US diplomatic, budgetary, and particularly programmatic resources for any of this to succeed. This really stands in contrast to the summit in Miami in 1994. It kind of launched these kinds of meetings, which was anchored rather by a series of targeted efforts to liberalize hemispheric trade in the hemisphere, in Latin America and North America. The LA summit lacked really a distinctive, or let alone a set of memorable policy pronouncements and commitments, and instead one is left with sort of a long list of pronouncements and joint declarations, and you can pick and choose which ones you think might be more important depending on the country that you're from. And I'll just name three of these here. One is the Inter-American Action Plan on Democratic Governance, and with its 32 action items. It's really a non-binding resolution. It sounds great, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it ultimately means in the long run. Second example, maybe in some ways a more notable output of the summit, is the Declaration on Migration and Protection, which actually does deal with an important issue dubbed the Los Angeles Declaration for further emphasis, with a hope on comprehensive regional approach to migration, including refugee flows. This is obviously a tall order. These are critical issues for everyone engaged in this arena. But for the United States and other key actors, this really brings to the table a series, sort of a toxic mix of foreign and domestic policy interests. So this is not going to be easily addressed. A third example is the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which was essentially a US-driven, I would argue, somewhat grandiose new economic plan or proposal for the Americas, which has a new sort of a series of contemporary buzzwords attached to it: supply chains, resiliency, limiting fossil fuels or decarbonizing economies in the region, and sort of vague references to sustainable and inclusive trade. Buried in the discussions at the summit were perhaps other kind of related commitments, including trying to revitalize the Inter-American Development Bank, obviously an important source of low-interest loans. I think I mentioned the reference to the IDB partially because I think there is an opportunity that needs to, an issue that needs to be addressed, and the reference to the IDB sort of brings that up, which is the crisis of credibility in two of the hemisphere's multilateral institutions, the IDB to some degree, as well as the Organization of American States, the OAS. My fourth and sort of concluding point brings us more closely to the Caribbean and the panel discussion theme here. I mean, outside of having two summits with a geographical connection to the region, Miami in 1994 and Port of Spain in 2010, the Caribbean has by and large had a low profile in much of these hemispheric conclaves. And I'm sure that today's panel will probably have much more to say about this. So let me just provide two closing observations on this particular issue. First, despite what initially looked like a potentially serious boycott of the CARICOM group of countries, triggered in part by a dispute over the absence of Cuba at the summit, as well as the presence only of the Guaido representative for Venezuela, ultimately all of this got papered over, and all of CARICOM members showed up except for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I mean, I may be reading too much into this display of diplomatic gamemanship by the Caribbean, but it had positive results, including a maybe greater leverage for direct meeting with President Joe Biden, as opposed to the original plan that had CARICOM meet with Vice President Kamala Harris. I mean, I think all of this, and a bit looking under the surface, is not to be underestimated and therefore quite important. Second, in a pattern that's common to many of these kinds of international conclaves, often the sidebar activities is really where the action lies. And the LA summit was no different, with parallel sets of private sector NGO sessions, allowing for, in fact, deeper layers of Caribbean actors and others to be engaged. And what ensued out of that was sort of encouraging display of inter-Caribbean agreements, particularly dealing with key issues such as food and energy security, transportation, the streamlining or removal of more tariffs among Caribbean countries, which in fact are issues which were just addressed at the heads of Caribbean leaders in Suriname. This kind of development positions the region also to press its own plans and preferences with Washington, rather than what has often been the case, it's the other way around. Obviously, one can say more about all of these themes, but one general conclusion is, I think, is that the summit set in motion a number of initiatives for the Caribbean, as well as for the rest of the hemisphere, but certainly for the Caribbean. And certainly, while arguably the US hosts and organizers may have fallen short, the burden really now lies with other summit participants to push ahead and translate the words into real action and memorable outcomes. I mean, there are weaknesses and flaws in these sort of international meetings, but I think they are ultimately potentially quite helpful and worth certainly pursuing. With that, on that sort of somewhat hopeful note, let me pass the baton back to Guy and the panel. Thank you very much.
George, thanks so much for that wonderful summary. And I think it has set the stage for a really great conversation, which, if you'll allow us, George, we'll rope you into in this panel discussion going forward. But maybe I'll start with Richard, the real architect behind the first Summit of the Americas in 1994. Richard, your leadership then was vital, I think, to ushering in a wave of promises and assurances, both in the lead up to the summit in 1994 in Miami and soon thereafter. In a recent Global Americans article titled "Creative Diplomacy for a Fractured World," you write that US diplomats at the summit deployed a sort of layered multilateralism. Can you describe for us what that term means and how it played a role in this last month's summit? And then maybe how that summit in 2022 compares to 1994, and whether those differences are mainly due to changing US priorities, to a changing US role in the hemisphere, or more broadly to kind of a different geopolitical arrangement that we're living in today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Guy. Pleasure to be on this panel with some veterans from the wars, as well as some new voices. I always love talking about summits. I think I'm here for a bit of history, so I will indulge myself. I really like George's presentation, by the way, particularly his phrase, policy by pronouncements, which I think would sound even better in Spanish, George. It's always an excuse for the US when it doesn't do well as well. You know, there were so many other crises around the world, distracted. You know, that's always true. The US is a global power. There's always crises. In the run up to the 94 summit, remember the wars in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia? Remember all that? There's always distractions, which is to say it's the job of the Latin American team to make sure that the senior policymakers focus on Latin America, particularly when you have an upcoming summit. And I have the scars on my back to demonstrate that that's what needs to be done. And that's the sacrifices that the Latin American team has to be willing to make to push their ball forward. Okay, so a little bit of history. You know, summits have had their ups and downs over the decades. There was a summit in '56 in Panama. There was a summit in '67 in Punta del Este, and then there were no summits for over almost 30 years until we got to '94, because, among other things, the hemisphere was so fractured and just there wasn't enough policy convergence. But when we get to the early 90s, you do have this opportunity of clear policy convergence in both economics and in politics. So we had the FTAA, of course, and I want to emphasize that that was pushed by none other than Argentina. Compare that Argentina of then to the Argentina of today. Similarly, democracy was pushed by Brazil. Compare the Brazil of that day to the Brazil of today. We were able to celebrate the restoration of democracy in Haiti, George, as I'm sure you remember. Compare that situation to the situation today. On anti-corruption, who took the lead in Miami? It was actually Venezuela and Honduras. How things have changed, right? So you do have a sense of, it is a lot more difficult now in Latin America, as George has emphasized, to get that consensus around those very key issues. The other thing I think one has to sort of admit is the quality of leadership in both Latin America and the United States. We had the youthful, visionary leadership of Bill Clinton and Al Gore. Al Gore already was talking about sustainability. He was already talking about digitalization back then. He was considered a weighty personality. So when he traveled around the region, as he did early on in a number of trips to help forge an agenda, there was, you could feel the respect in the room for him. And then, of course, in Mexico, we had Salinas and Zedillo. Compare those folks to the current leadership. We had Iglesias and Cesar Gaviria at the multilaterals. So it was a very different and more promising set of leadership. In the area of economics, we negotiated the FTAA, both in terms of what the substance would be, and then a whole procedure to move forward in negotiations, with a lot of energy and millions of meetings, with a very active USTR at the forefront at that time, together with White House leadership. Now compare that to what we had, shocking, actually, I thought, in Los Angeles, the so-called America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, or APEP, which was literally not negotiated, thrown out 3 days before the event by the US government. And I spoke to some governments who received the draft, and they said, like, what is this? We've never seen it. This is supposed to be a summit of the Americas, not a US conference. And we haven't had any chance to digest this. And moreover, it's just all over the place. It's not an initiative, it's a list of agenda items. So that was appalling. And then if we look at the attendance in the economic area, that was very telling. Catherine Tai, in and out in 24 hours. In other words, USTR essentially not there, no public remark. She canceled a planned remark before an IDB ministerial. Department of Commerce, nowhere to be seen. Gina Raimondo also canceled a set of public remarks. And I don't believe the US Treasury was present. Certainly Janet Yellen was not. So in effect, the US economic team boycotted Los Angeles. I want to talk about boycotts. They were the ones who boycotted Los Angeles. That is to say, they didn't want trade and investment on the inter-American agenda. That's what one has to read from that. Okay. So, and then on the democracy issue, that was flubbed because of the poor handling of the Cuba issue, so that Cuba's friends were able to paint the US as the exclusionary presence at the table. We were the ones who weren't democratic somehow. That issue was handled so poorly. So on the two issues that have been the centerpiece in the glorious days of Miami, of trade and democracy, the US was, how should we say, not in the leadership role. So finally, I would just agree basically with what George said on some of the other initiatives, which were not approved by the full House, but rather by subsets of countries. The immigration initiative, conceptually, it's interesting. I think most people who specialize in immigration were pleased with it. It has a comprehensive approach. It recognizes shares responsibility, talks about management of flows rather than repressing flows. So it's progressive in that sense, and therefore it's certainly worth trying to pursue. On PAC 30, particularly the Caribbean energy initiatives, again, conceptually, it looks very good. Again, there's a big gap between aspirations and allocated resources, but still worth pursuing. There was an interesting Latin American pushed initiative by the Chileans on marine protected areas, which might be applicable to the Caribbean, which also looked interesting, signed by, I think, 8 countries, including the United States, and John Kerry was there. So on what you might call the issues of the day, immigration, climate change, energy, there are some issues on the table signed by a subset of countries that would be useful to pursue, I think. Then I think we can recognize that over the years, summitry has been institutionalized. You have at the summit itself, as George mentioned, these parallel meetings, civil society, corporate, and governmental, and some interaction among them, and that's a good thing. And then you have, for the those who are deep into the weeds, you have the Summit Implementation Review Group and the Joint Summit Working Group, which pulls together 13 international organizations, including the MDBs, to help implement initiatives that have been approved. So all of that provides some institutional basis to move forward on the various initiatives. And I think, as George emphasized, the ball to some degree is now in the court of the interested countries in the region to try to hold the US feet to the fire and to try to get, I think they would have to sort of decide which of these many, many action items are real and which ones do they want to really pursue and try to move forward in that area. So thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Richard. I'll turn it now to David. And David, first of all, I want to say this is a pleasure to co-sponsor this event with the Caribbean Policy Consortium, one of many such co-sponsorships that we've done and we will continue to do. David, I know you're following APEP very closely, the Partnership for Economic Prosperity. On June 14th, just after the Summit of the Americas, the Office of the Vice President of the United States sent a letter to CARICOM requesting the establishment of 3 committees or groups on energy, food safety and food security, and finance. This is in part an effort to form working groups to intensify cooperation on a lot of the issues that George discussed and that Richard discussed, including PAC 2030, which we'll get into in a bit, and of course, the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. I'm curious from your perspective, and I know you have these conversations every day with folks in the region, how has APEP been received in the Caribbean? Is it, as George said, kind of a policy by pronouncement, though I know he didn't attach that to APEP in particular, but has it been received as policy by pronouncement, or has it been seen as a sort of framework through which countries in the hemisphere can engage in a much more deep way?
Thank you, Guy, first and foremost for the invitation and starting this collaboration between CPC and Global Americans. Particularly the second generation of leadership at Global Americans, since many of us had collaborated in the past with Chris Sabatini, another fellow summiteer from the past century, and particularly also for bringing in some of our new actors in regional initiatives like Alicia Nicholls in Barbados and Amparo all the way down from Uruguay, which is one of our pet comparisons for small economies in the Caribbean. Let me just point out quickly before I get to that point. One, the importance that whether or not succeeded, we really need to underscore the importance that summits are for heads of state and heads of government. If heads of state and heads of government do not attend, then you're going to have an institutional and structural weakness on commitments. Because commitments work, and Richard knows this better than any of us, when they are made by presidents or prime ministers. Frankly, secretaries, ministers, and so on, very important. I've worked for many of you have worked for many, but it just falls into the bureaucracy, whether it's a big one, like the United States, or whether it's a small bureaucracy, like St. Kitts and Nevis. So I think that's really a critical aspect. And indeed, it's a shame that we had that spat about participation, because I think everybody agrees, and many were saying it at the moment, that had there been canvassing and consultation in private beforehand, yes, people would have opposed, but no, there wouldn't have been this issue about not attending. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective, particularly as we move forward with other initiatives. And that really it's what gets the ball rolling. Yes, the vice president sent a letter, but that letter was not something that was instigated or initiated by the US government. What occurred on the US Caribbean agenda was that from April 28th, at a CPC FIU webinar, the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda, Sir Ronald Saunders, threw the gauntlet down and indicated, way before AMLO had even spoken about not going or going, that for the CARICOM member states, the exclusion of 3 countries was a sine qua non of participation. And particularly, he read US policy very well, the possibility that the US would want to seat Juan Guaido as the Venezuela representative would clearly immediately mean that all of CARICOM would not attend. Many of us have spoken to people, and indeed that was the plan. And what CARICOM did is they sort of threw the gauntlet down, forced the action, and then everybody else jumped on the bandwagon. But in addition to that, one of the more quiet issues that Ambassador Sanders mentioned was we need bilateral meetings at the presidential level. We're very happy to meet with Vice President Harris. We're very happy to meet with Secretary Blinken. But frankly, if we do not meet with President Biden, there is no use in terms of what we're doing. And what happened, as George mentioned, is there was that planned meeting with the vice president. They lobbied and got President Biden to go. And that's where this idea of these 3 committees on finance, energy, and food security came up. They're not really part of APEP per se. This is a bilateral initiative between the US and CARICOM, of which they've named now 3 co-chairs from the CARICOM side, Barbados for finance, Trinidad and Tobago for energy, and Guyana for food security, with ministers following up. And we don't know who the ones are from the US side, but we've been confirmed that the US has co-chairs. And just yesterday at the concluded CARICOM summit of heads of government in Suriname, they announced that they now have a series of short-term priorities which they put forth to the US government. So for the very first time in various decades, and at least certainly in this century, the demandeur from the region, in this case CARICOM, is now putting the items on the agenda to the US, not being an agenda taker, but being an agenda maker. Whether or not the US will be up to par, really, to respond to these things is going to be an issue. But as I've mentioned publicly before, woe to ye who does not follow up what Ambassador Ronald Sanders proposes, because he will be on you, as we say, like white on rice, and he will make it public, and he will shame the President of the United States for making commitments with his 13 presidents and prime ministers and not delivering. And I think that gamesmanship is now working. It's moving forward. APEP, I think, focuses on the entire hemisphere, things like nearshoring, which I know Amparo is going to speak about, the value chains and so on. And yes, there's a space for the Caribbean on that, but I think really a bit separate, because the region is not a manufacturing center anymore. It's services, and it's much smaller in terms of scale and volume. But I think really on those 3 areas of commitments, those are the priorities for the region. And yes, the summit has many, many issues. The region focused on those 3, and they're going to lead on those 3. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you, David. And of course, Sir Ronald Sanders, Ambassador Ronald Sanders, is also a member of the Global Americans High-Level Working Group on Climate Change in the Caribbean. What came out also of the summit was a number of remarks from Ambassador Sanders describing the meetings that he had with President Biden and Vice President Harris as a quote-unquote breakthrough moment for U.S.-Caribbean relations. But of course, as George mentioned in his remarks, a lot of work will have to go forward for that breakthrough to actually take place. And so we laid the frameworks at the summit, but the next steps will tell perhaps a different tale. I want to turn now to Alicia and ask somewhat of a similar question, which is kind of what has been the reaction in terms of your engagements in the Caribbean? What has been the reaction of the summit on some of these frameworks that we've already discussed, APEP, PAC 2030, and also the process question that David was alluding to, this idea that the administration decided not to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. We could talk about what things might have looked like if that announcement was made in say October of 2020 instead of a few weeks before. But I want to get your sense of how Caribbean leaders responded at the moment, and then what the reaction has been in the weeks after the summit.
Thank you so much again for the invitation to be here. And I hope you guys are hearing me well. Great. And I agree with David's analysis. A lot of the things that CARICOM would have wanted this time around were on, which makes it interesting what was said in the communique that was issued yesterday about the fact that they acknowledged the outcome, but also the fact that they didn't feel as though enough was done with regard to some of the issues that they raised. And one in particular I could think about is the issue of the flow of guns, which I know is a very touchy subject in the mainland US, but also for us in the Caribbean, we're seeing the implications of that. Let me give you an example. Just this morning, there was a shooting not far from where I live. And a lot of it is because of the guns that are coming in illegally, coming from the US. And that has serious implications for Caribbean states, not only in terms of the social fabric, also in terms of the fact that it has implications for investment, for instance, because if it is that we're trying to attract investment, especially for development purposes, if it is that investor feels as though, okay, you know what, I have to spend tons of money in security because people just shooting up the place, that's going to make our countries very, not as friendly for investors, so to speak. So there would be security implications there. So I do think, yes, and I completely, as I said, agree with David that this is particularly one summit where you really saw a lens on some of the issues that Caribbean states had, but then there's still some other issues that needed to be addressed and weren't addressed. And the whole gun issue, I could kind of understand because that's still a very ticklish issue in the mainland US. With regard to the not inviting the governments of the three countries, I think that what Caribbean states did was strategic in that they did, most of them, except for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, did attend. But what they made sure they did is that they registered their disappointment. Certainly Prime Minister Motley mentioned that diplomatically, of course, in her speech, when she talked about, you know, the fact that we have to include people even where we disagree with their opinions or where we disagree with their ideology, etc. And I certainly think, especially when you think about the issues like migration and what have you, when you think about the fact that Cuba is one of the main sources of illegal immigration to the US. I mean, you know, leaving out a country like Cuba, which needs to be at the table, particularly as Richard would have spoken about the very comprehensive, so to speak, at a high level declaration that was had on migration. It would have been good to have Cuba there at the table. At least Haiti was at the table, even Barbados, which is not a major source of illegal immigration to the US, but is considered a transit point in terms of, unfortunately, human smuggling, etc. Not a big source, but it is an issue that is being talked about more in Barbados. Barbados signed on, was one of the 20 countries that signed on to that declaration, as well as several other CARICOM states like Jamaica, Guyana, Belize in particular being one of the Central American countries which are transit points, etc. So I do think that there were some good things that came out of the summit. Again, I agree with George that a lot of these things are more high level, more declarations, so to speak, more policy proposals. And what needs to be done is more concrete timelines. We need, you know, what's the funding for some of these things? We also need to make sure that Caribbean states continue to be engaged in a lot of these things. We have to make sure that civil society is brought into the discussion. Not to get on a soapbox, but with regard to civil society, there's not as much feeding of civil society opinion in CARICOM as one would like. So that's something that we will have to do in the region to ensure that whatever we do, especially when it comes to these working groups, etc., that isn't just that it's at the high level, the political level, but there's that feed in from civil society, that feed in from academia, etc., to ensure that what is being proposed is actually evidence-based.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Amparo, I'm going to turn to you and maybe zoom out now to a more hemispheric reaction to the summit. At PricewaterhouseCoopers, you've developed a real expertise on tax policy and transfer pricing, among other issues. But of course, you're also an expert on all things Uruguay and Southern Cone. So I want to know from your perspective, what has the reception been like in countries like Uruguay in particular that have really shown an interest in opening up their economies? And maybe what has the reaction been not only to the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, but some of the other frameworks that were released in the summit? Has there been a sense of optimism among Uruguayans, particularly, again, Uruguay, a country that has been screaming at the top of its lungs for deeper engagement from US? Were those interests in some respects satisfied? And where do you see kind of the path forward?
Thank you, Guy. Thank you for the invitation. So particularly as it relates to the Partnership for Economic Prosperity, I would say, but I think that's true, as the other panelists have said, it's a beginning of a dialogue where, again, it's we're announcing initiatives and goals and the wanting to come together, but there aren't a lot of specific measures or initiatives happening right now. So the discussion, for example, around stronger, more resilient supply chains and nearshoring as an opportunity to bring some of the production from Asia into the region. Well, that's a great goal. But what does it exactly mean? Or decarbonizing the economy and working with the region on those matters. So like others have said, I think that and particularly George at the beginning has mentioned the contrast with the first summit in 1994 couldn't have been more stark. In this summit, President Biden tried to rekindle that spirit, but today the region is much more connected to China than it was back then. Back then, China barely made it into some of the top markets for the region. It was maybe like 1% of trade. Today, it accounts for 15% of trade, and in some countries, it's much more than that. You also see a lot of engagement with the infrastructure projects. So to put in perspective, 21 countries in the region are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would say that that hegemonic US leadership in the region, we're talking about a different world. And to your point specifically, and I don't know that I can call myself as a Uruguayan specialist, certainly in my heart, but I think it was disappointing to countries like Uruguay and Ecuador who are actively seeking a free trade agreement with the US. So again, when you think about the summit in '94 with the announcement of a free trade area of the Americas, like this massive block that will go from the northern tip of Canada to Tierra del Fuego, and you compare to where we are today, where we still don't have ambassadors, US ambassadors in a number of countries. So there's a big difference this time around. And again, we didn't have those significant announcements. And at the end of the day, it does appear that the US might be prioritizing some domestic issues like immigration over trade matters. One thing that I think is particularly interesting, so when you step back and you look at sort of the US trade with the region, Latin America, actually, the US has a surplus with the region. And that's a significant difference with other parts of the world, including Asia, where the US is running significant deficits. So you would expect the US to come with a much stronger agenda. The US does have trade agreements, free trade agreements with a number of countries, obviously with Canada and Mexico, but with some other countries like Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, and naming a few. And with countries like Uruguay, what we have is TIFA, which is the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which allows for sort of a coming together, a dialogue. So what could have been accomplished? What could have been the expectations? Well, if we cannot get to a free trade agreement, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, maybe there could have been developments in the area of customs, more sort of process improvements, digital trade. There could have been a lot of hemispheric progress made in that area. And I want to emphasize services, because here we're trying to bring some of the similarities, if you may, between the Southern Cone and the Caribbean, and services is making an increasing portion of trade. And as we know, services is not as impacted by the free trade agreements as some of the goods. And in that area, things like double taxation agreements could have been very significant. The US is not the most connected country when it comes to double taxation agreements. And these are very important for investments of multinational companies in the region. Instead, in contrast, the US is currently pursuing a framework with the OECD and with the G7 countries, the two-pillar, which doesn't necessarily benefit the US, Latin America, sorry. So basically the US is working with the OECD countries to push for example, a global minimum tax that could severely impact free trade zones in the region. Many of them are free trade zones for services like shared service centers. So again, if you're looking for that policy convergence when it comes to trade matters, then I would say that we're not quite there. And again, particularly interesting in the context of the US running surpluses with the region.
Thanks so much, Amparo. I want to bring George back into the panel discussion here, if I can. George, one of the leaders who did attend the summit was Ariel Henry, the acting president and prime minister of Haiti. Could you maybe briefly summarize for us the current political situation in Haiti? And I know this is something of a loaded question, so maybe it's impossible to do it briefly, but could you maybe talk a little bit about where you see the US's position toward Haiti today?
Thank you, Guy. Let me just say by saying that, so the interim prime minister did attend the meeting in Los Angeles. There was some question actually prior to that meeting among many Haitians as to whether he would even be invited or not. But in effect, he did go, and that created some opportunities actually, not so much for the Haitian government, but for Haitian civil society and other actors to press a variety of different issues among sort of side meetings in Los Angeles. The reason why the controversy even arose is, for those who follow Haiti, is that the prime minister has been in office for close to a year under circumstances that are, shall we say, troubling and in some ways also probably unconstitutional because of the death of his predecessor, Jovenel Moïse. The issue now in some ways broadens in the sense that by being in Los Angeles, it did provide an opportunity for Haiti, for the interim prime minister to also participate in CARICOM, Caribbean-related meetings and sessions. Often overlooked, but Haiti actually is a member of CARICOM, even though it doesn't really take much advantage of that. And therefore, let me jump ahead, Guy, and say that maybe what is more meaningful is what happened in Suriname just in the last few days with the heads of CARICOM leaders meeting, where the interim prime minister was there. It provided an opportunity perhaps for Haiti to tap into a little more actively into what CARICOM has in terms of capacity to deal with some of Haiti and the region's growing problems. One of them is food insecurity issues, issues dealing with health policy, particularly COVID related, and thirdly, to some degree, try to deal with the broader issue of which Alicia mentioned, in particular, dealing with the status of refugees and sort of migration flows throughout the region. This is a an ongoing crisis for Haiti because of its ongoing political instability, violence. There's been an outflow of Haitians both into the neighboring Dominican Republic as well as to neighboring Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas and ultimately Florida. And in fact, throughout the region, there are actually Haitians in Guyana and Suriname and Barbados. That's basically all over the region. Whether the fairly weak government of the prime minister is able to actually take advantage of all of that is unclear. I'll end with one opportunity, perhaps, that may emerge if Washington is able to muster the energy for it, which is to actually encourage CARICOM, as well as the Dominican Republic, who's not a member of CARICOM, but has a vested interest in what happens in Haiti, to actually be more engaged in trying to help Haiti through its multiple levels of crisis. But that requires, in some ways, some engagement on part of Washington, and that really hasn't been the case at this point. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, George. Richard, I'm gonna turn it back to you. And I think this has been, first of all, a fantastic conversation, and we're going to keep going with another round of questions here. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention two topics. One has been mentioned a bunch during this conversation, which is that of nearshoring or friendshoring, and the other is one of the major announcements that was made at the summit, the U.S.-Caribbean Partnership to Address the Climate Crisis 2030. That's PAC 2030. Richard, you've closely studied the Caribbean Basin Initiative and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how PAC 2030 in particular might compare with those earlier programs, and maybe a bit more about what that partnership might entail and what it might mean for the region. And then separately, if you could, maybe unpack the possibilities for us on friendshoring or nearshoring going forward.
All right, thanks. Well, those are a lot of important questions. I think the panel so far has really been spectacular, and I thank all the participants for their very sage and spot-on remarks, with which I agree wholeheartedly. Particularly Alicia's point about the importance of resources, of timelines, of accountability, of civil society engagement going forward. Those are all super important. I would say on the issue of China, by the way, I would give points to the administration here for not explicitly dwelling on China. Because had they been saying, well, really, this is all about a new sort of Cold War with Asia, everybody would have jumped all over them. And so even though that may have been in the background, the fact that they weren't explicit about that, I think they deserve some credit for. On the issue of nearshoring, here, it was odd that Tony Blinken, just a few days before the summit, in his remarks, I think at the Council of the Americas annual meeting, emphasized that nearshoring was going to be a major topic of the summit. What happened between his remarks and the US position at the summit? And all I can assume is, as David suggested, it's nice to have the endorsement of ministers, but if you don't have the president and the White House on board, there's a possibility of a slip. And it looks to me like that's what happened. And then when I see the sudden dropout of the Department of Commerce that had also been emphasizing nearshoring as an interesting option, that suggests to me that a decision was made in the White House that they were not going to go forward, at least at the summit, with any explicit nearshoring goals. A lot of countries were very disappointed. There was an opportunity, you have the AD countries now in this sort of emerging alliance, Costa Rica, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, the Alliance for Development in Democracy. And they're very interested in nearshoring. It's relevant to them. They still have an industrial sector that could benefit from an increase in nearshoring activities. And they had been led to believe that that was going to be a centerpiece in Los Angeles. And all of a sudden, at the very last minute, shelved. That would have been an opportunity for the administration to, rather than have everybody dwelling on the CAFTA-DR countries that weren't there, to embrace those that were there and that wanted to have increased ties, economic and political ties with the United States. And that was an opportunity that was set aside. And I think that brings us back to a point that several people have made earlier. What explains the weak show of the US? And some of it perhaps is bureaucratics and personalities, but in the end, it does come to the president and domestic politics. And on issue after issue, some vested interests within the Democratic Party prevented the administration from taking clear, strong positions. Certainly on trade policy. If you read the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, I don't usually agree with their editorials, but there was a strong editorial on Biden's missing trade agenda. Absolutely correct. A worldwide problem, not just in the Western Hemisphere. Appointing Catherine Tai as the head of USTR is like appointing to the EPA a major coal polluter. That is to say, someone who's completely contrary to the traditional goals of that government agency. And then on immigration, although the administration, as I said earlier, I think deserves credit for laying out an interesting framework in that immigration declaration, they weren't able to put solid numbers on it because of fear of backlash within the Democratic Party and from some elements of the Republican Party. Suppose the administration had said, we are going to announce temporary work visas for 500,000 Central American and Caribbean workers. Wow, that would have been the counter headlines that the administration needed to change the subject from Cuba. But they couldn't do that because of fear that would have gotten, the AFL and some Republicans would have stood up and said, this is open borders. So on issue after issue, the administration, and specifically one has to ultimately say President Biden, was unwilling to show leadership and make definitive, tough political choices, which would have enabled Los Angeles to have taken clear, major, quantifiable steps forward on some of these key issues. So I hope that responds to some of your questions, Guy.
Yeah, no, it was great. I'll respond very quickly to it as well, which is, as many on the call know, Global Americans has a big project looking at the U.S.-Ecuador trade relationship, namely the intersection between trade, indigenous rights, and the environment. And as we've engaged with the Biden administration and with actors in the hemisphere, I think the Biden administration, and I know Amparo mentioned this, and Richard, you just did as well. I wouldn't say that that USTR is, as I think Richard, as you described it, opposed to some of the traditional tenets of what USTR does. I think they are just responsive to domestic political pressures. And I think the issue that we've seen is that there are now protectionist tendencies on both the Democratic and the Republican Party. And the feeling, I imagine, in the Biden administration is that something like a comprehensive FTA is maybe not in their political interest because it will lead to a lot of pushback within those protectionist wings of both the Democratic and the Republican Party. And so it makes for a complicated moment, I think, particularly when juxtaposed with as Amparo mentioned, the wave of kind of free trade movements in the aftermath of 1994. That contrast was very clear, I think, in the aftermath of this summit in 2022. Amparo, I want to turn it actually to you and see if you had anything, because I know you mentioned nearshoring and friendshoring in your remarks. I want to see if you had anything to follow up on Richard's comments and more broadly where you see kind of the state of free trade, if we can still call it that, in the hemisphere.
Thank you. So from a global perspective, so we at PwC, we work globally, and of course there's been a lot of attention on supply chain, both from a geopolitical perspective but just also logistical. And I think that's really one of the key. So nearshoring is as much a political as it is a business initiative of basically bringing more resilience to supply chains. There's this expectation of diversifying sources. It's a great opportunity for the region. So nearshoring, by definition, is bringing production closer. And some people call this from just in time to a just in case. So basically diversifying your resources just in case you require different or there's, again, all the things that we've been experiencing with COVID. In that regard, I would say that the trend, this is a significant expectation. A lot of policymakers have been discussing it, but we don't necessarily see this as much. I think a lot of US multinationals continue to engage with China, have significant investments there. And maybe what we are seeing is this diversification. And the countries that seem to be benefiting the most are other Asian countries. So not so close, so not so much the proximity to the US that one would have expected. So this is an important opportunity, but again, we're not necessarily seeing it. And then on the other hand, and I think you mentioned that, I think the US, it started with America First under President Trump, and it's continued now. There's a significant initiative to bring jobs home. That also, when you look at tax reform and various other incentives for production domestically, the incentive is to come to the US. And what we are seeing is in the US a significant increase in production. So I would say, again, nearshoring is a great opportunity, but I don't know that today we see the policies, the trade liberalization towards the region that really support that increase. Mexico might be better positioned. Some of the countries with bilateral trade agreements with the US might be well positioned. For other countries that are knocking the door, not so well positioned at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Amparo. David, I'm gonna turn it to you with something of a similar question, because I'd love to hear you comment also on all of these issues, but I also want to incorporate a question on PAC 2030, which is, I know that you've closely followed and watched the growth of Suriname and Guyana in recent years. I'm wondering how you see PAC 2030 fitting into those countries in particular, their kind of development strategies, but more broadly, what do you see as the reception in the Caribbean to PAC 2030? And then again, this question of nearshoring and friendshoring.
Sure, thank you. I'll take PAC 2030 first. I think it's first and foremost, if there's any group of countries in the world that has a endemic, an existential commitment to low carbon strategies, renewable energies, and the climate change agenda, it's the islands of the Caribbean that live this day by day, including the continental countries of Guyana and Suriname, which are below the sea level, and they're being affected seriously. So I think that's first and foremost to understand. In addition to which, these are countries and economies which need income generation business today for people in the countries today. Yes, we love the next generation. Yes, we love our grandchildren, but it's the people today that need to be taken care of economically, and particularly with the damage done to employment, jobs, and income from the COVID crisis and the lockdowns. So when you see initiatives with the boom of Guyana, which is now becoming the #1 per capita country in terms of oil exploration and soon gas, Suriname as well, Trinidad's 100-year plus experience in oil and now leveraging gas, and you couple that with the Russian war and the global energy climate war that we have, basically everybody says, you know what, just like with tourism, we can get business and we can get money tomorrow with an energy agenda, and that's what's happening. I would say that at the same time, though, and they made it very clear with PAC, and that's why energy is one of those 3 committees with the US, is that it's energy, climate change, and renewable fuels. It's that it's a package deal. I don't think the administration, again, pushed by the domestic agenda of the anti-fossil fuel crowd in the Democratic Party, understands that. And I believe, unfortunately, at the summit and subsequently, Special Envoy John Kerry is missing the possibility for a constructive dialogue with the Caribbean if he continues to push this anti-fossil fuel agenda in a region that is now becoming the sexy partner of the world for energy. One final point a lot of people haven't realized. There are islands in the Caribbean, we've counted now 8 dormant exploration license agreements running from Grenada all the way to Bahamas. Each and every one of those governments is now undusting those agreements and ready to get exploration going, because they realize, 1, you can do it, you will get income fast, and 2, despite all the environmental concerns, we are at a cutting edge of oil and gas exploration technology, which is also safeguarding a lot of the risks of the environment and a lot of risks of possible damage from the past. It's not perfect, but they're realizing this is an avenue that we can build on. So I think unless the administration is able to be flexible in its approach on this, they're not going to have anybody to dialogue with on that energy and climate change agenda in the Caribbean if, in order to enter the room, you have to leave your oil and gas outside, because right now those countries in the Caribbean are carrying it in big luggages and they go with it everywhere they can. And it was reinforced now at the CARICOM summit. So I think that's something that's going to be important to see. On the nearshoring agenda, you know, I think it's as Richard mentioned on summits, when we have presidential pronouncements, it's very important. But what's funny is nearshoring has been happening very well since the USMCA negotiations started in 2019. And countries like Mexico, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and countries in the CAFTA region have been taking advantage of opportunities, regardless of whether there's a pronouncement or a policy from the US or a legislation in the US Congress. Why? Because you do not need it. It's useful if you have it. It's nice to get that imprimatur, like when the current president of the IDB, Mauricio Claver Carone, was in the National Security Council and he announced Americas Crece in 2020. That gives you traction. But guess what? People in the business world, investors, and people looking to get closer to the US market, they're not waiting around. And what we're seeing, I think particularly, is 1, a push in many countries. Yes, I agree with Amparo. The large volume scale countries like Mexico, even a Colombia, have an advantage. But we just finished with the IDB last year a 12-country assessment of nearshoring. You'd be amazed what's going on in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Haiti, in the BPO call center industry, and even in agribusiness and in energy services. So there's a lot of opportunities. They all just may not be Intel setting up a plant in your country like happened in Costa Rica 20 years ago, but it is taking place. I know we're soon to finish. I just wanted to add one point because it would be remiss for at least the old fogies in the crowd.
Yeah,
Institutions matter, like Richard said, if you have the andamiaje, the infrastructure, but individuals in history matter a lot. If President Clinton had not named Mac McLarty special envoy, none of this would have happened in Miami and subsequently, because you had one person in the administration who was not a bureaucrat, not beholden to any government agency, direct line, friend of the president, pushing this forward and getting people going. If you don't have that, that's missing. We had for a short period of time last year, a Caribbean director, only for the Caribbean, in the National Security Council Western Hemisphere. That position has now folded back to Caribbean and Central America. So I'm a bit concerned on the focus for the Caribbean, and every administration says it, none have done it. But really, for me, it was a qualitative difference having a special envoy, as well as the personality of Mac McLarty, a great person, to really push these issues on the agenda and get them moving. And I think that's something that's missing and needs to be considered at some point in time.
Thanks so much, David. So I think we'll get to maybe really quick questions now to wrap up here. I will say just quickly in response to David's points, or to that last point, that just for everybody's awareness, there was 2 senior advisors to the summit. There was Chris Dodd and there was Debbie McCarcel-Powell. But point well taken in terms of the relationship to the president and kind of the voice that McLarty had. I want to turn quickly to Alicia and see, and this is actually a question that I'll pose to the entire group as we close here. What do you see as the principal challenge for implementing some of the commitments made at the summit? And then as I pose this to the entire group, Richard, I would love for you to directly answer a question because I think you're very well situated to answer it, that was posed by one of our audience members, which is, we have heard of the saying, physician, heal thyself. Can the US really regain the regional influence it had during the summit of 1994 if the US has so many internal quote unquote ailments? So I'll start with Alicia and then maybe we'll go to Richard and then we'll go around the horn here to close.
Okay, thank you so much, Guy. Well, one of the things I would mention is the fact that a lot of these things are broad proposals, but they need to be drilled down on, and we need some timelines with regard to some of these things. And one of the things I really want to emphasize is the fact of the longevity of some of these initiatives, because 2024 will soon be here. We don't know who is going to be president after 2024. We have seen that there are reversals in US foreign policy on certain things like climate change, for instance, depending on who's in office. So I think that's one of the things on the back of a lot of people's minds is that, okay, even if we get running with these things, what happens after 2024 if there's a change in administration? So I'll defer to my colleagues as well, because I know time is running up.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Maybe Richard, we'll go to you.
Okay, well, that's a very big and tough question. So I think, first of all, it's important, as I think has been emphasized here, that convergence on policy issues has to do not only with the United States, but in the region itself. And a lot of the problems, frankly, has been the decline in the quality of leadership in Latin America as compared to, say, 94, and the willingness of countries to take populist rhetorical positions rather than try to actually engage with the United States in a positive way to solve problems. So there's the issue, there's the problem on that side. Now in the US, I would put it, you have the problem of we're not the shining light on the hill anymore with regard to democracy, and that is clearly an issue. I do think Secretary Blinken plays that pretty well. I give him a lot of points, by the way, for his engagement in Los Angeles. He was there for several days. He spoke to everybody, NGOs, private sector folks, and of course, his counterparts. And he does it with a sense of empathy and open-mindedness. So I think he did quite well, from the point of view of a foreign minister. But the essential problems have to do with the divisions on each specific issue. So if you're talking about immigration, are we in favor of more migrants coming into the US to fatten the labor markets or not? Are we in favor of moving more supply chains? And David says, yes, some will move into the market, but really accelerating it such that rather than getting sort of anemic growth in the Caribbean basin, could we have Asian growth rates in the Caribbean basin? And that would require active government policies. Are we in favor of that or not? Are we in favor of open markets or not? So on every one of these critical issues, are we in favor of renewable energy or carbohydrate fired energy? We're about to see the President of the United States go to Saudi Arabia and kiss the ring of the Saudis. Wait a minute. I thought we had a policy that emphasized renewables. Where are we on all of these critical issues? So you have huge divisions, including within the Democratic Party, and I think the governing party, and that's why the White House has been unable to plot clear policy lines on these issues, which would enable the U.S. to really engage. Similarly, even on the tax issue, Treasury has taken international taxation, which Amparo mentioned. That would have been a great issue to tackle in the summit, but it would have had to have been done in a very organized way months before with senior level consultations among finance ministers. And we just didn't see that level of active, organized engagement to then have an issue, a tough issue, sufficiently massaged to bring up to the summit for final decisions. So that's what would be required. And my last point, so people talk about putting together financial packages. in the Caribbean on energy or whatever, nearshoring, whatever, and say, well, how about the DFC, Development Finance Corporation? It was created to do that, right? But if you read the poison pills were put in by elements of the Democratic Party and some Republicans into that legislation, which makes it so difficult for the DFC to actually engage on specific projects. It has to do with the income levels of the countries. It has to do with not harming any American workers, such that, and I mention that because that's exemplary of the internal divisions within the US, broadly stated politically, but also even within the Democratic Party. Are we in favor or are we not in favor of providing an environment in the developing world and including in the nearshoring area that would accelerate investments in those countries or not?
Thanks so much, Richard. Maybe Amparo, do you want to follow up?
Sure. So, yes, I would say it's time to focus on the tactical to move the agenda forward. I would like to also add that some countries are indeed looking to opening to free trade. For example, it may have gone a bit unnoticed, but Mercosur is lowering tariffs from outside the bloc. Uruguay and Brazil are in the process of ratifying a bilateral agreement that allows for import-export from free trade zones with no tariffs. So these are important developments that are happening. Some of the countries are indeed opening up. So I would say there's significant challenges in the world, and it requires working together, significantly interconnected world. Some massive challenges like climate change require coordination across the hemisphere. So hopefully we are entering a period of strengthened multilateralism and coming together of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll
Local
go.
voice, we like that.
Maybe we'll go to David, and then we'll finish where we started with George.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you all. This has been excellent. I'm glad we got off to a great start. Richard makes a great point about DFC because precisely one of the detailed issues in the US CARICOM 3 committees, the one on finance, is precisely how to be able to flexibilize DFC requirements so that they can work in middle-income countries like the Caribbean. So that's going to be an issue that will be clearly on that agenda. I think in addition to what we've been discussing, we haven't mentioned, and it was also kind of missing at the summit, the role of Congress and the way that in the past in summits and so on, Congress and people working on Latin America and the Caribbean have been engaged. This is Guy's area of work from his past experience, and that was a missed opportunity there. I think for the Caribbean also, and George mentioned at the beginning, the administration lacked bridging the democracy summit of last year, in which all CARICOM countries were there, to the issues now of governance at the level of the summit. And of course, your best partner for that in the Americas are the English-speaking nations of the Caribbean. And there are issues there, like Alicia mentioned, with regards to arms trafficking, narcotics as well, and others. But this is your go-to partner on democracy and governance. And that sort of, nobody's taken advantage of that. So I think there's a missed opportunity and something that can be, that can certainly be built on. We missed talking on the Haiti issue, the whole linkage with Dominican Republic, which really at the end of the day is the country that has to deal with Haiti day in and day out because they share one island. And actually there was a push at the summit, you'll recall, Richard, where the Dominican Republic President, Luis Abinader, was making the point that I need the Alliance for Democracy and Development countries, Costa Rica and Panama, and now Ecuador joining, but all in the Americas, to take Haiti as a hemispheric agenda, not just a Dominican Republic agenda. So I think that's something that's clearly there. I think the final issue at the end is, outreach and engagement. And really, the challenge after a summit is, What are we going to continue with in terms of outreach and engagement? And who are the key players in a US administration that countries can be knocking on their door, right into their WhatsApp, calling their cell phones and so on. And I think the Caribbean has figured that out with 3 very discrete issues: food security, energy, and the finance development issue. I'm not sure many of the other countries have that yet, but I think that we're going to see some exciting new initiatives pushed by CARICOM on these 3 points, and we'd see how the US administration is going to be responding to that, because there's going to be a need for traction. One final comment. I love the best quote in all the summaries that we did during the weeks leading up to the summit and during the summit. Jorge Jaime, former ambassador of Chile to South Africa, to China, to India, an original Caribbeanist. Jorge cut his teeth in Puerto Rico on Caribbean studies in the 1970s. He made the point, listen, when China comes to Latin America, the discussions are about roads, investments, building infrastructure, getting trade and getting investment going. When the US comes to Latin America, the discussions are about, oh, corruption, you know, elections, oh, inclusion, all these issues, which frankly, for most of the countries in the region, are not day-to-day issues of resolving the issues of people. And there's a big gap there, because the US used to talk about building things, getting trade going, getting investment going. And I think that is missing. And that's where the US is missing in terms of being that hemispheric player that all countries, if not most, that most countries, if not all, look up to.
But we need to do both, right, David? We don't want to have the cynical position of just pure economics of the Chinese. We need to do both, democracy and investment.
Yep. Richard, you took the words out of my mouth. So I'll actually just turn it over to George, and then we'll quickly close.
Maybe just a final comment that in some ways repeats this superb discussion, which is to use maybe Amparo's reference to tactical focus. The Caribbean actually now has an opportunity, CARICOM countries in particular have an opportunity to really energize these sort of 3 areas that are making up the working group between CARICOM and the United States. It won't be easy. None of these issues are particularly straightforward and simple, but actually provides an opportunity for CARICOM to push its regional agenda. I would feed a little bit on some of the related comments, including one that David just made, which is particularly since Haiti is part of CARICOM, to emphasize the role that Dominican Republic has to play in this particular area. It would help. This goes on another related comment. It would help if the United States had formal representation throughout the region at the ambassadorial level. Haiti, for example, in the middle of its layers of crisis, that actually does not have a U.S. ambassador in place. It gives you an indication, a little bit of some of the weaknesses that U.S. diplomacy has to work with at this point in time. But a lot to work with. As the point was made earlier by all of the panelists, the action now in some ways is not so much in Washington, but in some ways by the other participants in the summit to take advantage of a variety of opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And thank you, everybody who has been with us throughout this conversation. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you also to Jackson Mim and Bo Carlson of the Global Americans team, who have done all of this work behind the scenes. And just a note that this is one of many webinars that Global Americans will be rolling out in the coming weeks, some in collaboration with the Caribbean Policy Consortium, which we're very grateful for that partnership. But please look to our website for more information. And again, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying tuned. Stay well, stay safe, and we look forward to next time.